All right, so here is our quick little video on democratic change in England. Remember, the last time we were in England, it really was the Industrial Revolution and all the economic changes that happened there. Well, the economic changes that occurred during the Industrial Revolution also are going to play a larger role in the political changes that are happening in the 19th century that we've been talking about for the past month. So, just a quick recap, right? The 1800s is the story, in many ways, of the struggle for democratic rights and the pull between the democratic rights people and the socialists on the even farther left and the forces of conservatism and monarchy. Now, these groups that were pushing for democratic rights were often seen as a threat. Remember, in France, going back to the 1789 revolution, we have the Third Estate, the lower classes, the Jacobin radicals, and the sans-culottes in the streets who are pushing for more rights, getting rid of the monarchy and calling for a republic in which people have a vote and a say. This is John Locke's consent of the governed theory. In England, what we're going to see in the next couple of days are groups called the Chartists and the suffragettes, particularly these two groups that are pushing for an expansion of the franchise or voting rights, suffrage rights. Before we hit these people, though, I want to talk a little bit about the backdrop of England as opposed to France and the rest of Europe to get a sense of what was going on there. So, were these groups a threat? Let's take a look, because a lot of the people who were looking in England at the time in government were wondering, how do we handle the expansion of the vote, these calls for reform? What does the French Revolution mean to us in England and all these other movements that are happening? Are we more of a Metternich conservative type, or are we in the middle, kind of like a Francois Guizot, who's willing to have voting rights but limit them? Or are we going to go so far as Babot and Louis Blanc in the extreme version of political rights and even economic rights for workers? To recall, this is the context of our citizen student project. The problem of our country, the Meisterland project we have now, is the majority of our population is disenfranchised. Wealth and power are in the hands of a few, and groups A, B, and C's political and economic needs are being ignored by those in power. Of course, some of you are in that group, the power group. The goal is to create a society where all of the people have a say. You have the government group maintaining power and stability. How do we do that? And the teams will develop a plan and make a move very shortly, I promise. Going back to England, the way England dealt with rights goes back a lot farther than and deeper and earlier than the French Revolution. So in England, as far back as the Magna Charta of 1215, you have nobles who are pressing the king, King John at the time, to guarantee certain rights and that taxes won't be levied upon them unless they have a say. And this is only the nobles, it's very limited, but it's the idea that the king's power is not absolute. So the fact that the king had to answer to people, even in elite, wealthy, noble people, goes back a lot farther than it did in France. The Glorious Revolution in 1689, without going into huge details about this, what it does is it removes a king that misbehaved, basically, and it put in power a new set of monarchs. But those monarchies had to live alongside the English Bill of Rights, and it gave power to Parliament to be the lawmakers. So by 1689, you already have a king checked by a Parliament. This is the constitutional monarchy. That's the big difference between France and England, is that England was an absolute monarchy. France was an absolute monarchy, and England was a constitutional monarchy. The voting requirements to take part in this body politique, the civil society, was that you had to be male and you had to own large amounts of property. Basically, about 1 in every 100 person had a vote in Parliament at the time. And the House of Lords was like the upper house, and then you had to be a nobility, titled nobility. But the House of Commons was the commoners. But these commoners were still people who owned tons of land and wealth and property. And so 1 in every 100 person could vote for the House of Commons. The Industrial Revolution is cooking in the 1750s and brings about a lot of changes. Just to recap some of these in one slide. You have cities growing in population, but they don't have any representation in Parliament. So you have a growing middle-class population, a wealthy middle-class population too, but they can't vote, they don't own enough property, and they actually don't have any reps in Parliament. Most of the parliamentarian representation are in the countryside where the wealth used to be held. And that's beginning to change in the Industrial Revolution. You also have a new middle class growing. These are the bourgeoisie owners of the industries. These are not nobilities who own huge estates, but they own factories, they own businesses. And they range from pretty wealthy to decently wealthy, but they can't vote. They don't own enough wealth to vote. You have the industrialists running the economy. These guys will probably be the upper middle class. They're part of the middle class, striving to live like the aristocracy, but they can't vote either because they don't own land and property and enough wealth, believe it or not. And then the fastest growing class are the working class who are in the factories, and they certainly can't vote, as most of them are renters. And even if they owned a little parcel of land or a house, it was very, very meager and not enough to have any vote. So we begin in the story of this whole century is more and more people calling for an increased suffrage rights, votes. And the government, as the Industrial Revolution chugs on in the 1800s, begins to look outdated. We don't want landed aristocracy having all the vote, and there's these middle class industrialists who are running the society. You have workers who are creating the wealth, but none of these guys have a say in what goes on. And certainly women are going to not even be considered people in terms of politics until much later on, and they're going to be instrumental in pushing for that view. Like a lot of the movements in France and in the rest of Europe, we begin to have demonstrations in England. And one of the most famous examples is the Peterloo demonstrations, where you have, if you look on the stage, you can see these are respectable people. These aren't crazy radicals here. They have jackets and ties and top hats and well-dressed people looking for universal suffrage. It's kind of hard to read. But the person who made this cartoon made a point of putting liberty caps on top of their flagpole. Look at the top of the flags. They have liberty caps. This is a direct reference to the sans-culottes and the Jacobins. And this is trying to portray them perhaps with the taint of reign of terror and radical republicanism. And so these guys are middle class people, you're kind of quote unquote respectable people, but they're being treated and portrayed here as dangerous. And they're being, you can look closely here, they're being suppressed and massacred by the troops that are sent in to crush the demonstrators. But these demonstrations begin to happen sporadically between the 1820s and early 1830s, and it begins to call for change. All right, and if you look at this, there's a big debate going on, and the purveyor of this cartoon is referencing the reign of terror in the French Revolution. You've seen this before. This was not actually made in France. This was made in England in the 1820s after the Peterloo demonstrations and other protests for more political rights. These are portraying the conservative views that if we let reform, if we let revolution happen, this is going to be a slippery slope of chaos. And you have some on the political spectrum saying, no way are we going to allow any reform. This is just, I'm frightfully afraid of universal suffrage, voting rights, and we really don't want to give in. On the other hand, you have people who are saying we deserve these rights. And in the middle, you have people who say we better give something because if we don't, it's going to break. We're going to have revolution. In order to prevent this chaos, we need to give in a bit. What the French didn't do under the monarchy, and look what happened. So you have England, disenfranchised people who are pushing for rights. The question is, revolution is near. How do we avoid that? Parliament asked this question. What should we do? And remember, these people are the upper aristocracy. These people don't have to listen to the people to get their vote, but they're trying to avert disaster. Now, 1830 comes around, and you have more and more of these demonstrations in England. You have the July Revolution in France that just got rid of Charles X. Remember the Three Glorious Days? And so English people, respectable English people, are getting worried about how do we avert this here in good old stable England. What they do after much debate is pass what's called the Reform Act of 1832. What this did was it lowered property qualifications to vote, so more and more people can vote. In fact, after this act, 1 in 32 people were now able to vote. And this greatly expanded the electorate. It made it much more democratic. And now you have the middle class bourgeoisie who own and run the businesses and manage the businesses of this new industrial economy. They now have a say over Parliament. And now the House of Commons has much more representation based on the new population. It also gave more ministers of parliament, MPs, parliamentarians, to the urban districts, which had more people. So as the traditional narrative goes, you have the disenfranchised protest and rally. This inspires and puts pressure on the middle class, who will then vote for reforms and create reforms and petition and create new elections. And this is how we bring democratic reform and change. And it's this happy march towards democracy in England. Or what? Did it really bring democracy to England? Was the Reform Act a step towards democracy, or was the Reform Act merely a conspiracy between the wealthy and the moderately wealthy groups, the kind of the right people, to suppress the rabble working classes, who still, if you now think about it, don't have the right to vote? And these are often the ones who are in the streets pushing for more change. So I'm going to have you guys watch the next video on democracy and the Reform Act. And I want you to take a listen to what this guy's theory is. The historian you're going to listen to, he's going to give you his take and his interpretation of the Reform Act. And then I'll ask you to post your response on the Google Class.
Well, here I am outside the Palace of Westminster, the seat of Parliament since the 13th century, and if you like, the focus of this entire story. And as I've explained, Parliament in the early industrial period was unrepresentative of any but a small fraction of the population, basically just a landowning elite. But in the 1830s, two dramatic events shook Westminster. The first was a massive fire that destroyed almost the entire building, not important to our story, but a symbol that change could occur even here. And the second was a piece of legislation, a law pushed through Parliament. And it's vital to understand this act if we're to understand the anger that rippled across Britain in the late 1830s. And this crucial piece of legislation was the Great Reform Act of 1832. Now, you read old-fashioned history books of 19th century Britain, and you'll find the Great Reform Act hailed as a triumph, a milestone on the onward march to democracy. And it's true, certainly, it made Parliament more representative. It gave MPs to the new industrial towns. It doubled the number of voters. And yet it caused such anger. Why? Well, to be honest, I don't think it was a great Reform Act at all. I think it was a nasty, small-minded, hypocritical little Reform Act. Because, and here's the point, the MPs that passed this act, they weren't interested in increasing democracy in this country. They were trying to block democracy. They thought, if we give the vote to a few more people, all of whom, like us, have property, if we give the vote to cozy middle-class folk, to industrialists, to factory owners, to bankers, to shopkeepers, then they'll help us keep the vote out of the hands of everyone else, the rabble, the swinish multitude. 1832 was the moment in British history when the propertied classes in the countryside and the propertied classes in the towns joined forces, closing ranks against the poor, the labourers in the countryside and the workers in the towns. The Reform Act was met with celebration amongst the middle classes, those with the tidy sum of £10 a year who now could vote. But the act confirmed to the workers their powerlessness.